Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a little poem called Thoughts. This is poem number 6 of the 29 of By the Roadside. Now, we have already pointed out that 40 times in Leaves of Grass you have these one-word titles. 9 times we get to play this game in By the Roadside. And the word thought or thoughts comes up as a title 8 different times in By the Roadside, which I think is significant, and we want to pay attention to the way in which Whitman is clearly playing around with these kind of reflective types of lines. Now, there are people who kind of throw these types of poems out and say, well, they're kind of a waste of our time. I'm going to argue, though, that Whitman is creating what I have called in Leaves of Grass a sustained theodicy. That is to say, he's trying to answer the question, why must bad things happen? And how can he be an optimist given the time that he's living? Of course, we think of the terrible, horrible Civil War. And yet somehow Whitman was able to find an informed optimism, as we've called it. We'll talk more about it in a bit. Now, our assumptions are that you have your own copy of Leaves of Grass, and you're heavily annotating, and you're working with us at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt. Everything from the inscriptions in Cabin Ships at Sea. We're going to have 2 references here, which will be echoes that will take us back. All the way up to, I've given an introductory set of comments for By the Roadside, and we just finished with Germs. Now, our Nortons will tell us a little bit about this background of this poem. In Leaves of Grass of 1860-67, a 6-line poem identified only as number 2 of the cluster Thoughts. This consisted of the present lines 2 to 5, preceded by this couplet, quote, of waters, forests, hills, of the earth at large, whispering through medium of me, end quote. In Leaves of Grass 1871, the poem became 7 lines, Whitman having superimposed the present first line, previously the initial line of Thoughts, number 4. In Leaves of Grass 1881, Whitman dropped the couplet, the initial lines of 1860 seen above, reducing the poem finally to the present 5-line offering. Now, it is 5 lines, but it's a compelling 5 lines, so let's enjoy it. Again, Thoughts. Of ownership, as if one fit to own things could not at pleasure enter upon all and incorporate them into himself or herself. Of vista, suppose some sight in arrear through the formative chaos, presuming the growth, fullness, life now attained on the journey. But I see the road continued and the journey ever continued. Of what was once lacking on earth and in due time has become supplied, and of what will yet be supplied. Because all I see and know I believe to have its main purport in what will yet be supplied. Now, if you count the of the after the final hyphen, you've got 4 of these ofs, which is kind of interesting. For sure 3, right, that will begin the lines. Let's play the game now right away with the word thoughts. Notice it takes us back to the beginning of Leaves of Grass in Cabin Ships at Sea. Here are our thoughts. Again, just the 3rd poem into Leaves of Grass, this word thoughts gets used, and then it will come back again and again. In other words, I think what Whitman likes to do in Leaves of Grass, and I told you guys, he's having lots of fun in Leaves of Grass. I think one of the things he likes to do is like this. You know, I got this idea, and it kind of comes off as maybe just thrown out there. You get to decide whether it makes sense or not. I find that a fascinating way to write his, what I'm calling, sustained theodicy. And he begins with ownership, and of course we're thinking about Marx already. We'll come back to this idea of owning things a few words later. Notice your dash, which obviously makes us think of our Emily Dickinson. We've seen the use of the dash throughout Leaves of Grass. Of ownership, as if one fit to own things could not at pleasure enter upon all and incorporate them into himself or herself. By the way, you'll remember this idea of pleasure back to Eidolons. Take a look at how he uses the word there. And this use of entering upon all, go back and look at what he says, for example, in Song of Myself, passage 48. To glance with an eye or shore beat in his pond confounds the learning of all times. He loves to use this word all, and here he's used it already. And incorporate them into himself or herself. Go back and look at Song of Myself, passage 31, the way he uses the word incorporate. In other words, it's an amazing thing to think about what it is actually that you own. I'm going to argue at 3a that This is one of the most Thoreau-like of sets of lines, and we've given full lectures on Walden at learnstrong.net. But this idea, what is a man is rich in proportion to the things he can live without? This is kind of the argument, I think, that Whitman is making here of vista. And this idea of vista, we've seen this already through Leaves of Grass. Of vista, the idea of the view. Go back to Song of Myself, passage 36, right? And on the knoll, the landscape and the road. Of vista, suppose some sight in area, that is to say, in the rear, back to starting from Palmanac 18, where he used this for the first time, through the formative chaos. The only use of that phrase, the only use of the word formative, actually, in all of Leaves of Grass. I told you guys, Whitman is pedagogue, Whitman is teacher. We're going to see and learn an astronomer. In the next poem, I think Whitman is very much in teacher mode in By the Roadside. The formative chaos, presuming the growth, obviously with Leaves of Grass being the title, the growth, fullness, life, now attained on the journey. You'll remember this use of the word the journey, or the use of the word journey in Broadway Pageant 3. It obviously makes us think as well of the Odyssey, no question. But notice in parenthetics, I see the road, and obviously we have to think of the Song of the Open Road here. I see the road continued and the journey ever continued, and then the parenthetic again. The idea here being that there's lots to see, but there's so much more to see. Tennyson, very much an influence in Whitman's thinking here, I think, with his poem Ulysses, when he gives that sense of that there's always the next thing to see, right? This notion that we're always looking for the next thing, right? I'm a part of all that I have met, yet all experiences an arch where through gleams the untraveled world, whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. That idea, of course, to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. No question that the word thought, and here thoughts, might be easily connected for us. I think Tennyson is behind a whole lot of the stuff of By the Roadside as well. And then the third of, which we'll assume a fourth of as well, of what was once lacking on earth and in due time has become supplied. We're going to come to this idea in a little bit. And of what will yet be supplied. And then he'll finish. Because, and it's almost as if he's creating some kind of an argument here. All I see and know, notice again the use of the word all, I believe to have its main purport in what will yet be supplied. Now, I find this fascinating the way he constructs this. Notice he talks about ownership, talks about what you can see, and then he reminds us that the road that we're traveling must continue, and that in fact the journey is ever continued. In other words, lifelong learning. We've said, and some of you have asked, why exactly is it that we're having these talks with Walt? Like, what's the point? Here's one of the arguments. You're always learning. You're always finding new ideas. You'll never want to come to a point in the life's journey where you say, I've finally arrived, as we've often said. It isn't the destination. It isn't Ithaca. It's the journey to Ithaca that really matters. I think a whole lot of the Odyssey is standing behind this set of lines. But notice the informed optimism once was lacking on earth. In other words, everything is about evolution, including ideas. And there are ideas which have to evolve to come to fruition on the earth. And in due time, and of course that idea of due time is a very religious idea as well. Whitman knew exactly the game he was playing, has become supplied. In other words, the things you need, the universe will supply for you. And of what will yet be supplied. This is again that futuristic, and then of course the word because. Everything in some ways is hinging on this idea of formative chaos. I think that's one of the central ideas in all of Leaves of Grass, which is why I don't throw away little poems like this out of Leaves of Grass. Sitting hidden in some ways right here in the middle of Leaves of Grass is this notion of formative chaos. Why? Because all, again the word, he loves it, all I see and know, again we're back to epistemology, I believe 20th time in Leaves of Grass, if I'm counting correctly, 20th time in Leaves of Grass is right here, right now, when he uses this term, I believe. And we've pointed this out several times, that this is, in many ways, Leaves of Grass is kind of a treatise on what it is that Whitman believes. And I love to challenge students okay, so you've told me what you don't believe, you've told me what you're upset about, you've told me what you don't like about this world, great, fine, now tell me what you do believe. And more importantly, once you tell me that you do believe those things, tell me how you're going to accomplish living your life believing those things? What will you build with those beliefs? I think we can learn a lot from Whitman's formulation here, because I see and know, I believe to have its main purport in what will yet be supplied. In other words, what's he saying? Well, he's arguing that no matter how great it is right now, there's more coming. In other words, I think Whitman was thoroughly convinced that he saw you and me and this thing we call America in this world way in the future. And I think he saw it, and I think he's trying to predict in his, again, sustained theodicy, that pain and suffering is the formative chaos, is propedeutic. It's instructional. There's something to be learned, which I find fascinating, given this is the little poem that will precede Learned Astronomer that we'll get to next. But before we get there, let's finish really quickly at 2a. Well, I think that life for Whitman is, in fact, formative chaos. It's a fascinating phrase, and I think it's a good way to think about our lives. That is to say, yeah, there's a lot of chaos. The question is not, when bad things happen, why did this happen to me? As if somehow, again, you're a victim in a universe where all this stuff is happening to you. But rather, you're in control. You get to decide how the chaos forms you, how it forms me. That is to say, we have to learn to ask, why did this happen for me? Do you hear it? Formative, for me. Okay, we're playing, obviously, that game. At 3b, the rhetoric stuff, I just like you to take a look at the just pristine balance of a little poem like this, where you'll have the ofs, and then you'll have the dashes, and they will kind of balance each other rather nicely. I mean, you can count ofs as 3 or 4, depending on how you want to read it. I've already mentioned this at 3a, and I think it is fair to say that this is in some ways one of the most Thoreau-like of poems in all of Leaves of Grass. I think that Thoreau and Walden is playing a very similar game. You'll remember he said, I went to the woods because I wish to live deliberately. To understand, in other words, this thing that he calls formative chaos, that Whitman calls formative chaos. You'll remember just a few lines above that, though, I went to the woods to live deliberately, that he says we must learn to reawaken and to keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn that does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. He says it, I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of a man to, you'll remember, a human being, he would be obviously arguing, to be able to construct that life around a conscious endeavor. And I think that's the key, the conscious endeavor, the informed optimism, the idea, oh no, there's stuff coming that will supply everything that's needed. Finally, of course, at 3b, we got to try and own a poem like this. I think this is one of those poems that you got to go for a walk and ask a question like this. Is your life, is my life, constructed around formative chaos? Is that really what it is? In fact, well, our life is constant chaos, but we have this amazing ability to form something out of that chaos, that genesis, that origination, cosmogonic idea, that out of the chaos something will arise that is a life, and is quite a remarkable one. And then finally, how about this? Just to look at the very last lines. Do you believe that all you see and know has its main purport in what will yet be supplied? Do you buy that? Do you believe in that? Is there a level of informed optimism in your life that from this chaos, some form can be created? Let's move on again, as I said a few seconds ago, to Astronomer. Thank you.